Okay, we were discussing yesterday the differences between Nevi'im and Kesuvim. Which books make it into Nevi'im, which books make it into Kesuvim. And once again, there are a number of differences, and sometimes one difference applies and sometimes another difference applies. Difference number one is there is a distinction that we don't fully understand between Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah. When one is a Navi, now we discussed, this is not so pashut either, but the simple understanding, as the Rabbanel says, is that at least when they're writing the book, they get a word-for-word communication by God. God says, write this, write this, write this, write this. Meaning even if the original Nevuah was through pictures or images, the kesiva of the Nevuah was al pi Hashem. That's a prophetic experience, as opposed to the Kesuvim, which was a Ruach HaKodesh. In other words, you don't have a sense of God telling you what to write. You're writing, but you're inspired by Hashem. Right? So that's one nafkamina, Nevuah versus Ruach HaKodesh. Now, what's interesting is that this could be the same person. For example, Shmuel Hanavi wrote most of the book of Shmuel as Nevuah, and he wrote Megillas Rus Beruach HaKodesh. So, Sefer Shmuel is in the Nevi'im, and Rus is in the Kesuvim. So that's one chiluk between Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. The other chiluk is that in the case of Nevuah, the Navi is given a mission to communicate orally, and in Kesuvim, there was no mitzvah to communicate. In fact, maybe there wasn't even a mitzvah to write, but there was certainly no mitzvah to orally communicate. The point I want to make is, therefore, let's take two books. I'm going to pick two books at random. Rus is in the Kesuvim, and Daniel is in the Kesuvim. But I want to suggest that the reason why Rus is in the Kesuvim is not the same reason why Daniel is in the Kesuvim. Rus is in the Kesuvim because the writing of Rus, even though it was by Shmuel, who was a Navi, the writing of Rus was Ruach HaKodesh, number one. It was not through Nevuah. And number two, Shmuel was not given any mitzvah to communicate this orally. And indeed, as far as we know, he was not even given a mitzvah to write it. So we have two reasons why Rus is in Kesuvim, although Shmuel was a Navi. Number one, Rus was written under Ruach HaKodesh and not Nevuah. And number two, there was no divine command connected to Shmuel to communicate this orally, and perhaps there was not even a divine command to do it in writing. Tehillim is exactly the same way. David HaMelech had moments of Nevuah. Chazal count him as a Navi. But Tehillim was not written by Hashem dictating a word for word. Tehillim was written by Ruach HaKodesh, and there was no divine command. Hashem didn't tell David to write Tehillim. And Hashem certainly didn't command David to say the Tehillim to people. So those are the two reasons, let's say, why Rus and Tehillim are Kesuvim. Number one, because they were not written under Nevuah. They were written under Ruach HaKodesh. And number two, there was no command to communicate them. Yeah.
How does the experience of Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh differ? That Nevuah, you're seeing images, you're getting something from Hashem, and Ruach HaKodesh, you're just like it's the same thing of like when a doctor performs a surgery, certain knowledge appears in his mind because he studied and he knows it. How do these things play out differently for the person getting?
Well, there are different experiences. For example, people say Rashi wrote Rashi under Ruach HaKodesh, but Rashi didn't hear words. Rashi didn't hear voices telling him something.
Right.
He just acted. He acted on his wisdom, but his wisdom was a special infusion of divine inspiration. Now, it's hard for us to tell the difference, but apparently it's what's called an inspired writing, but it's not a writing in which there's any type of dictation that you're aware of. No one is whispering in your ear what to write. Now, when we look at the book of Daniel, it's very clear that Daniel had prophetic experiences. Because when it describes how Daniel is perceiving his visions, all of the classic instances of Nevuah are there. He becomes weak. He becomes faint. He loses consciousness. A malach speaks to him and tells him the future. So unlike, let's say, Tehillim or Rus, that was Ruach HaKodesh and not Nevuah, much of Sefer Daniel, he actually experiences Nevuah. He experiences Nevuah in two different ways. He experiences Nevuah by the changes in his consciousness that a Navi experiences. He's like taken over. And he experiences Nevuah by virtue of his predictions of the future, or he's shown visions of the future. So both in terms of content and in terms of style, Daniel undergoes prophecy, not Ruach HaKodesh. So if that's the case, why is Daniel not a Navi? Why is he in Kesuvim and not Nevi'im? The answer is only the second reason. Even though he had prophetic experiences and reached a prophetic state, he was not given a command by Hashem to communicate that message, and therefore it doesn't have the status of Nevuah. Now, the point I'm making is, the reason why Rus is in the Kesuvim is a different reason than why Daniel is in the Kesuvim. Although Rus has that other reason as well. With Rus and Tehillim and Mishlei, we're dealing with Ruach HaKodesh and not Nevuah. That actually means the words in Tehillim are not God's words. The words in Mishlei are not God's words. The words in Rus are not God's words. They are the human words written under Ruach HaKodesh. Now, in a sense, it's God's words, but it's not God's words in the sense of you hear a voice telling you what to write. It's David HaMelech's words. Now, Daniel's words, at least when he's quoting the Nevuah, might literally be the words of a god or the words of the angel. But Daniel is in Kesuvim because Daniel was shown private visions and was not told to communicate them. Which means, as you look at the books of Kesuvim, there may be different reasons why things are in Kesuvim and not in Nevi'im. Okay, I hope it's relatively clear. Of course, this is presupposing, in everything I just said today, is presupposing the Abarbanel's Yesod, that in the books of Nevuah, the Navi is getting a word-for-word message from God what to write down. As I say, that's not so pashut either. I mean, nothing is pashut here, but if we go with the Abarbanel, the words of Nevuah are dictated by God like the words of the Torah. By Ksuv Mitvada, it was not that case. It was a Ruach HaKodesh. I'm writing, and Hashem is inspiring me, but I'm writing, they are my words on a conscious level. They are not the words of God, but they are the words inspired by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, Daniel might actually, at least when he writes the visions, is actually writing the words of Hashem or the words of a Malach, but that's not Nevuah because he was not commanded to communicate it. He certainly was not commanded to communicate it orally, and it could even be he was not commanded even to write it down. Shmuel wrote Rus, not al pi any tzivoy. There was no command at all for Shmuel to write Rus. Shmuel wrote Rus because, the basic idea was he wanted to legitimate the yichus of David HaMelech, because David HaMelech was the great-grandson of Rus the Moabite, and the Torah says Moabites, even if they convert, are not allowed to enter the congregation of Hashem. So many were saying that David HaMelech was puzzled to be part of Klal Yisrael. So Shmuel wanted to show that the halacha was that female Moabites are permitted, as is evidenced by the fact that Boaz, who was the tzaddik and the Gadol Hador, married Ruth. So the whole story of Ruth was to legitimate the yichus of David HaMelech, but that was Shmuel's decision. Hashem didn't tell him, write that book. Shmuel wrote the book, and Chazal understood it was Ruach HaKodesh. So therefore, it becomes part of the Ksuvim. It's not part of the Nevi'im. Okay. So that was point number one, that there are different reasons why some books are Kesuvim and not Nevi'im. Okay. Now, the other point I want to make is, I just want to give you a short list, interestingly enough, of books that are alluded to in Tanakh itself as books of Nevi'im that are not part of our Tanakh. We don't even, not only are they not part of our Tanakh, we don't even have the books. This is especially the case in Divrei Hayamim Beis. Divrei Hayamim are the chronicles of the kings of Yehuda, and typically it'll give you the story of the kings. It actually overlaps with the book of Malachim, and we'll talk about why repeat the same story. But at the end of every king, not every king, but most of the kings, it'll say, if you want to know more details, look at this other book. Divrei Hayamim refers you to other books. And there are different titles for some of those other books. Some of them might not be holy books at all. They may have been the equivalent of secular histories. Now remember, let me give you an example. In Megillas Esther, which is the Ksuvim, it was written with Ruach HaKodesh, right? So in Megillas Esther, it says at the very end, if you want to know more about Achashverosh, if for whatever reason you're interested in knowing more about Achashverosh, go check Sefer Divrei Hayamim L'Malchei Madayu Paras. Go and check the chronicles of the kings of Persia and Media. Now, what book is that? What book is Divrei Hayamim of Malchei Madayu Paras? It is a secular book. It's not a holy book. In other words, what essentially the Megillah is telling you is, we've given you the information that Hashem wants you to know via Ruach HaKodesh. You want to know other stuff, so go buy a history book. Right? Go to Amazon and get a history book. So it's fascinating that sometimes Kisvei HaKodesh themselves will refer to a totally non-holy book. Right? So that's one example. Divrei Hayamim L'Malchei Madayu Paras. It's not even a Jewish book. The historical book of the kings of Persia and Media. Okay. Now, in Divrei Hayamim, our book, which is Ruach HaKodesh, right? Divrei Hayamim Beis, it refers, if you want to know more details, you should look at the book of the kings of Yehuda and Yisrael. Yehuda is the southern kingdom of 2 tribes, and Yisrael the 10 tribes. Now, it's not clear when Divrei Hayamim refers to the book of the kings of Yisrael and Yehuda. Is it a cross-reference to our Sefer Malachim? In other words, it's essentially telling you you'll get more details in our Sefer Malachim. So in other words, it is a cross-reference within Tanakh, or is it a reference to some secular book that had many more details? Now, I know that obviously your initial reaction would be, well, listen, if we have a book of Tanakh that's called Sefer Malachim, and Divrei Hayamim says, check in the book of Malachim of Yehuda Yisrael, one would automatically assume that it's a cross-reference to Sefer Malachim. On the other hand, the problem's going to be, and again, right now you won't fully understand this, that sometimes it's giving you a cross-reference in which there is nothing in our Sefer Malachim that gives you any more information. So what would that mean, therefore? That would mean that it's possible that the reference to the Sefer Malachei Yisrael B'Yehuda is once again a secular book that had more details about wars and other things that were not considered to be of spiritual value. In other words, it would be analogous to the cross-reference in Megillas Esther to Malchei Madai Uparas. However, sometimes there is actual reference to works written by prophets. It doesn't just say the book of Malachim of Yehuda v'Yisrael. And by the way, I would also say that sometimes it calls it the book of Malachim of Yehuda v'Yisrael, and sometimes it says the book of Malachim of Yisrael and Yehuda. Are those two different books? Are they the same book that they just switch the order sometimes? Don't know. Okay. But I just want to give you a list of works of prophecy that we don't have at all. It mentions at the end of David HaMelech's reign, these are all taken from Divrei Hayamim Beis, that if you want to know more about David HaMelech, look at the works of Nasan the Navi and Gad the Choseh. Choseh is also a Navi. So apparently there was a book of Nasan HaNavi and Gad HaChoseh. Now these are two prophets. They're identified as prophets. So where is that book? Why isn't that book in the Nevi'im? See, it's not like Divrei Hayamim, L'malchei Madai Uparas, which is just a secular book. These are books written by Nevi'im. So why don't we have them? And why aren't they in Nevi'im? So on this, one might give an answer. One might say that the reference to the books of Nasan HaNavi and Gad HaChoseh might actually be a reference to the book of Shmuel. And the reason is the following. Shmuel himself dies in the book of Shmuel. In fact, he dies at the end of Shmuel Aleph, so the whole second half of Shmuel. Shmuel is not alive. So even though Shmuel is the author of the book of Shmuel until his death, who is the author of the book of Shmuel after his death? So the Gemara says it was finished by Nasan HaNavi and Gad HaChoseh. So as a result, this is a very simple answer. When it says, if you want to know more about David HaMelech's life, look at the book of Nasan the Navi and Gad HaChoseh, that's just another way of saying, look at the second half of Shmuel, which indeed, David HaMelech's life is mainly in Shmuel Beis. We call today Shmuel Beis. So, on that we have a very good answer, that there is no separate book of Nasan HaNavi and Gad HaChoseh. The book of Nasan HaNavi and Gad HaChoseh is the second part of Shmuel, which gives you the rest of David HaMelech's life in more detail than Divrei Hayamim. By the way, I don't have an answer to this. Why is Nasan called Navi and Gad called Choseh? They both translate as prophet. Why are they given different titles? I don't know. Something to think about. There must be a reason, but I don't have a good reason for that. Okay, so that explains the conclusion after David. You want to know more about David, so look at the books of Nasan HaNavi, Gad HaChoseh. Now then, though, after it gives Shlomo's life in Divrei Hayamim, it says, if you want to know more about Shlomo's life, here is where it tells you to go. Go to the books of Nasan HaNavi, Achia Hashilani. Achia Hashilani means Achia, the prophet from Shiloh. And somebody called Ye'ido HaChoseh, Ye'ido, the prophet, who prophesied about Yeravam. Yeravam was the first king of the 10 tribes, but apparently he incorporated some information about Shlomo. Now, this must refer to a different book of Nasan HaNavi, because in Shmuel Beis, we actually don't know anything about Shlomo. So unlike what I said after David, that the reference to Nasan HaNavi and Gad HaChayzeh could be Shmuel Beis, here we have a work that's written by 3 prophets. Apparently, they collaborated on a single work of prophecy. Nasan HaNavi, Achia HaShiloni, and Ya'idai, Yud, Ayin, Yud, Daled Vav, Ya'idai, HaChayzeh. Where's that book? And why isn't that book in Nevi'im? Achia HaShiloni actually is a very famous prophet. In fact, he is mentioned a number of times, but he has no book. So what book is this? It's not a secular book, it's a book of Nevuah. So why wouldn't it be Nichlal in Sifrei Nevi'im? We don't even have it. So here, this is a very interesting point in which the Kesuvim are alluding to a book of a Navi that we don't even have. So there are 2 reasons, and both reasons are really connected. Reason number 1 is, if we go with the Abarbanel's Yesod, that a Navi not only gets prophecies from God, but a Navi is given a prophecy to write down his prophecies. It could very well be that the book of Nasan and Achia and Ye'ido was simply a memoir of the prophecies they got from God, but God did not command them to write down those prophecies. Therefore, it's just a memoir. Memoirs of Nevuah do not enter Kisvei HaKodesh. In order to be Nevi'im, it has to be the Kesiva itself. Has to be Al Pi Hashem. That's one answer. The other answer, which actually may be the same answer in different words, is that the Nevuahs that they wrote down were of ephemeral value and were not of eternal value. And therefore, Tanakh preserves only Nevuahs that are Tzricha L'Doros. Now, in fact, this may be the same as the first reason. In other words, it may be that God didn't command them to write it down because it was not Tzricha L'Doros. These are 2 different lumduses. One is there was no commandment to write them down, so it's only a memoir. So even if you got Nevuah, if Hashem didn't command you to write it down, your writing it down would not make it a book of Nevuah. And the second is it was not Tzricha L'Doros. So apparently in the time of Divrei Hayamim, this book was available on Amazon or whatever it would be, but in the course of time it got lost. It was not considered a holy book. It was not in Nevi'im, it was not even in Kesuvim. And this is the book of Nasan HaNavi, Achia HaShiloni, and Ye'idai HaChayzeh. Once again, we have this problem, Navi, Chayzeh versus no title at all. In fact, Nevi'im are referred to in 3 different ways. Sometimes they're called name of a person, HaNavi. Sometimes they're called name of a person, Chozeh. And sometimes they're just referred to by name. Achia HaShiloni just means Achia from the city of Shiloh. He's not called a Navi. He's not called a Chozeh, although we know he is. Then, of course, there are other questions. Why is he referred to by his place? That's the opposite question. Where did Nasan come? He said, Nasan HaNavi, from where? Don't know. God, the Chozeh, from where? I don't know. Achia HaShiloni, I know Achia is from Shiloh, but he's not called a Navi or a Chozeh. So there's a certain inconsistency. You're switch. Number one, some get a title and some don't, and some get a place and some don't. Now, Lagabi that, the Gemara itself gives an answer. It seems to say that if you're not told where the Navi comes from, he comes from Yerushalayim. So that's why we only mention the place of the Navi, or the origin of the Navi, when he's not from Yerushalayim. So maybe you don't want to have two titles. You don't want to say Achia Hashiloni Hanavi. Okay, maybe once you have to put in the place, you only get one title added to your name. So if you're from Yerushalayim, so we don't have to add the place, so we call you a Navi or a Choza. If we have to give the place, so you don't get the title. You don't get two things. I don't know. Again, I'm here more to just raise the question and not answer them. Yeah.
Could it be that they preserved in the drafting?
It might be. It might be. You might be correct because we often don't know the origin of a rabbinic teaching, and perhaps they were based on those books. Did Chazal actually have the books? Were they preserved as oral things? I don't know. It's a good point. Now, the next mention is Rechavam. Now, Rechavam is Shlomo HaMelech's son. Remember, under Rechavam is when the 10 tribes revolted. So Yeravam took over the 10 tribes during the Malchus of Rechavam, leaving Rechavam with only 2 tribes, Yehuda and Binyamin. And of course the Beis HaMikdash, Yerushalayim. So after it goes over Rechavam's story, it once again says, if you want to know more detail, look at the book of Shemaiah Hanavi and Iddo HaChoza. So again, it's the same problem. There is no book of Shemaiah Hanavi or Idai the Chayza. So once again, we have to, and clearly these are not secular books. These are books written by Nevi'im. But once again, even if it was B'Nevuah, there was no mitzvah to write them down. And therefore, they don't have the status of books of Nevuah. Now, I don't expect you to memorize names. Note that after Shlomo, there was a Navi called Ya'idai HaChayzeh. And after Rechavam, there's a Navi that's called Iddo HaChayzeh. One of the things that you will discover in Nach is that sometimes the same people, names are spelled differently. In other words, I don't know. Is Ya'idai the same as Idai, or are these 2 different Nevi'im? Not clear. But after Shlomo, there's a Navi Ye'idai HaChayzeh. After Rechavam, there's a Navi that is called Idai HaChayzeh. Again, the point of all this, I don't want to overwhelm you with details that are not possible to really remember. But the point is that there are references to books of Nevi'im that did not enter the Nevi'im, did not enter the Tanakh, and were not even preserved, because they didn't have the status of Divrei Nevuah. Similarly, we have a king Avia. Now, Avia is just Rechavam's son, meaning Divrei Yam does this for every king. It basically says, if you want more information, look at this book. And here it once again mentions the book of Iddo, the Navi, without mentioning Shemaiah, but it calls it the Midrash of Idai Hanavi. Once again, all I have are questions here. Nobody talks about this. Is the Medrash of Iddo Hanavi the same as the book of Iddo Hanavi? Did Iddo Hanavi write a Medrash? Does Medrash even mean like the way we associate Midrashim? Okay. And then a final reference is like a king later, Yehoshaphat. It mentions the book of Nevuah of Yehu ben Hanani. Again, who was a Navi? We have nothing from him. So the point is, there were books written by Nevi'im that did not become Sifrei Nevuah or even Sifrei Kesuvim, because there was no. Apparently, they were not even written under Ruach HaKodesh, because if they would have been written under Ruach HaKodesh, they would have been at least the Kesuvim. In other words, I'm a Navi. I get Nevuas. And when I retire from the Navi business, I want to write a memoir of everything that I heard. So I'm writing Nevuas. But if at the time I'm writing it, I'm not in a prophetic state, or I'm not in a Ruach HaKodesh state, I'm just writing my autobiography, that will not be Sifrei Nevi'im, and it will not even be Sifrei Kesuvim, even though it's a book that contains prophecies, amazingly enough. But there was no command to write it, and the reason is because the information was not necessary lidorot, meaning there were many prophecies that had a certain ephemeral need for the time, but they were not considered to be permanent. Yeah.
Why can't we say that something had Ruach Kodesh for like a temporary bit of time or for its purpose then, and then Hashem felt like it wasn't necessary for all the doros. So it didn't have to be that it was like strong enough that it had to be there forever.
That's a possibility too. That is a possibility that there was Ruach HaKodesh for that particular circumstance. Yeah, yeah.
In the books that were written with Ruach HaKodesh, how do the narrative parts of the books work where the writer isn't present? How does the writer know what is happening? For example, with Ashverosh, he woke up in the middle of the night. How does the writer know that all that happened?
So that's actually the Gemara itself proves that Esther was written. See, it's interesting. When it comes to Esther, we discussed this. There's a machlokas. If Esther is part of the Kesuvim or Esther is not. Now, everybody's motive, there's a mitzvah to read the Megillah on Purim. That's not the question. But is it a book that was written with Ruach HaKodesh? Because if it was a book that was not written with Ruach HaKodesh, it would not be in the Kesuvim. So the shaila is, again, please be sure you understand this. Nobody is disputing that there's a chiyuv to read the Megillah on Purim. But the question is that that doesn't necessarily mean it's a holy book. That might just mean that this is a historical recounting of the miracle in which we have to thank Hashem. But the Gemara's conclusion that Esther's Baruch HaKodesh is exactly, the Gemara in Megillah says, how did they know what Achashverosh was doing? How did they know what Achashverosh was thinking? That's what Ruach HaKodesh, it kind of enables you, even though you're not hearing a voice, but in your mind you see Hashem is showing you what happened. That's what Ruach HaKodesh is. That's exactly what the Gemara says. Okay, so now the last thing I want to do is I just want to go over very, very briefly a brisa in Bava Basra, Daf Yudalad, the first parak of Bava Basra, that some of this I talked about already, but I'm going to add some things, which goes over the authorship of the books of Nevi'im and Kesuvim. Who wrote the different books? Whether it was B'Nevuah or whether it was with Ruach HaKodesh. So I'll go over it fairly quickly. Yehoshua ben Nun wrote the book of Yehoshua. And of course, according to one opinion, he also wrote the last 8 verses of the Torah. The book of Shoftim and the book of Shmuel, until Shmuel's death, were written by Shmuel Hanavi B'Nevuah. He also wrote Megillas Rus, Baruch HaKodesh, on his own, without being commanded to write them. The rest of the book of Shmuel, after Shmuel Hanavi's death, which does correspond more or less to Shmuel Beis, was Nasan Hanavi and Gad HaChoza. By the way, now you understand when it says in Tachanan begins, Vayomer David El God. Sarli Maod, I'm suffering. So people are wondering, how is David talking to God, the son of Yaakov? I mean, God was dead. The answer is God HaChoza. He's speaking to God, the prophet, asking God for some reassurance that Hashem will have rachamim on him. Vayomer David El God. Okay. Now, the book of Malachim was written by Yirmiyahu Hanavi. And Yirmiyahu Hanavi wrote 3 books. He wrote the book of Malachim, He wrote the book of Yirmiyahu, which are books of Nevuah. And he also wrote what Chazal called Kinais. Kinais means lamentation. So it's very interesting. The English word for Eicha, we call it Eicha because that's the first word. But the English word lamentations is actually a very good translation of the rabbinic term for the book of Eicha, which are lamentations over the Churban Beis HaMikdash. But you'll note that Malachim and Yirmiyah are in the Nevi'im, and Eicha is in the Ksuvim because it was not written b'Nevuah. And Yirmiyah was not commanded to write it. Either he was not commanded to write it, he wrote it on his own. Okay, so that's that. 1 second. That's us. Yep. Now then, let's talk about. Yes, the next thing is Chizkiyahu. Now Chizkiyahu HaMelech was a very righteous king. He was a descendant of David HaMelech. And Chizkiyahu HaMelech was at the time of the exile of the 10 tribes, around 100 years before the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So Chizkiyahu and his Chachamim, his assembly, are credited with writing the following books: Shir HaShirim, Mishlei, Koheles. Now wait a second here, we have a big problem. Mishlei, Proverbs, Shir HaShirim, and Koheles are the 3 books of Shlomo HaMelech. So what does it mean Chizkiyahu and his assembly compiled Mishlei, Shir HaShirim, Koheles? I thought Shlomo HaMelech wrote Mishlei, Shir HaShirim, Koheles. So the Gemara means the following: Chizkiyahu and his group decided, now these are all Kesuvim, not Nevi'im, which parts of these books are Ruach HaKodesh. Apparently, Shlomo HaMelech left a much larger literary output than we might assume. Chizkiyahu and the Chachamim of the generation, which is a few generations after Shlomo, went through these books and decided which were Ruach HaKodesh and which were not. And as a result, they put the imprimatur on Mishlei, Shir HaShirim, Koheles, and a lot of other works by Shlomo were Divrei Chachma, but they were not incorporated in Tanakh. Now, this does raise a question, because if we understand that this does not mean Chizkiyahu wrote Shir HaShirim, doesn't mean that. It just means they canonized it. They sanctified it. So how could there be a machlokes in the time of Rabbi Akiva in Maseches Yadayim if Shir HaShirim is Matamei Yadayim or not? And Rabbi Akiva is the one that said, Kol HaShirim Kodesh. Shir HaShirim is Kodesh Kedoshim. And it seems that the canonization status of Shir HaShirim was not clear until Rabbi Akiva's time. How could that be if already Chizkiyahu HaMelech, 100 years before the Churban Bayis Rishon, they determined it was Ruach HaKodesh? You see, if you would learn the Gemara literally, Chizkiyahu wrote Shir HaShirim, okay, so you could say there was a later debate, was it Ruach HaKodesh? But that's not what it means, because Chizkiyahu clearly did not write Shir HaShirim. Shlomo HaMelech wrote Shir HaShirim. So the only thing Chizkiyahu could have been doing is determining if it was Ruach HaKodesh. So you hear my question. So if they determined it was Ruach HaKodesh then what is the machlokes in Maseches Yadayim 1,000 years later? Okay, question. So I apologize. I'm just raising more questions here. Okay. Now, one thing, Chizkiyahu did a 4th book. Chizkiyahu and the Chachamim, it's not alone. it says they did Yeshayahu as well. Because Yeshayahu was a Navi who died during the reign of Chizkiyahu. In fact, according to some, Chizkiyahu married. When Chizkiyahu didn't want to get married because he thought he would have a son that was a Rasha, Yeshayahu said, marry my daughter and maybe that'll be an insurance policy. Lamaisa, it wasn't. He had a son, Menashe. But Yeshayahu was Chizkiyahu's father-in-law, according to this. And Yeshayahu died, and Yeshayahu had many, many nevuas. But the one who assembled those nevuas were Chizkiyahu and V'siyate. And once again, that must mean a type of editorial function, meaning there was Tochacha, Yeshayahu had nevuas, and Yeshayahu was also a teacher of Torah. He gave shiurim. So when Yeshayahu died, there may have been thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and there had to be some great people who were able to determine what were words of nevuah and what were not. So Chizkiyahu V'siyato, Chizkiyahu and his group had editorial functions that resulted in Sefer Yeshayahu, Mishlei, Shir HaShirim, Koheles. Mishlei, Shir HaShirim, Koheles are Kesuvim. Yeshayahu is Nevi'im. Yeah.
These editorial functions, do we have to say that was also done through Ruach HaKodesh? Or how would they know which words are flown on the Torah?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It would have to be through Ruach HaKodesh and Lanias Daiti. Even the certification of a book of Nevuah does not require Nevuah to certify it. In other words, they didn't certify it through Nevuah, but they certified it through a Ruach HaKodesh and the like. So the final stage in the canonization is Anshe Knesses Hagdola. Now the Anshe Knesses Hagdola were 120 elders. This was actually the end of the biblical period, at the beginning of the Bayit Sheni. And among the Anshe Knesses Hagdola was Ezra, was Nehemiah, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, the last prophets, the beginning of the Bayit Sheni after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. And they, it says, they did Yecheskel, they did Trei Asr. Now, once again, this doesn't mean they wrote them down. Yecheskel wrote down the Nevuas of Yecheskel, and Trei Asr are 12 Nevi'im. They wrote down their books. So once again, this must refer to an editorial function of determining what was Nevuah. So it's interesting that of the three big prophets, the largest prophetic books, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, Yeshayahu, it says Yirmiyahu wrote Yirmiyahu, and apparently he left nothing that was not prophetic. So that's why we're not given, there's no editor for Yirmiyahu, because what he wrote was simple Nevuah. But Yeshayahu needed the editorial decisions of Chizkiyahu V'siyato. Yecheskel needed the editorial decisions later of the Anshe Knesses Hagdola. This is after his death, and Trei Asr. And the Anshe Knesses Hagdola also certified Daniel in the Ksuvim. And of course, they also did Megillas Esther. Mordechai and Esther wrote Megillas Esther. And the Anshe Knesses Hagdola determined that it was with Ruach HaKodesh. And finally, Ezra himself wrote the book of Ezra, which in Chazal includes Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah is Ezra, and Ezra wrote Divrei Hayamim. So one thing, the one book that is not mentioned in the Brisa, I think it's the only one, is Sefer Iyov. It does not mention the authorship of Sefer Iyov. And the Gemara in Bava Basra has many, many different opinions. But according to one opinion, Moshe Rabbeinu himself wrote the book of Iyov. And yet, It's not part of the Torah. It's Kesuvim, right? It's not Nevi'im. It's Kesuvim. So even Moshe Rabbeinu did not always get direct dictation from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He wrote it with Ruach HaKodesh. In other words, you could be the same person who's a Navi, in a different capacity, is acting under Ruach HaKodesh. So the book of Iyov, according to one opinion, is as old as Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Yeah.
Did Moshe Rabbeinu report real events, or was this
So that's another machlokus. In other words, there are two sets. There's two machlokim here. One is who is the author of Iyov. The other is Iyov a real story, or it never happened? It's a parable. It's a mashal. It's interesting. Why would Moshe Rabbeinu write about Iyov? Because it's interesting that after the Chedo Ego, in the Torah, he asks Hashem, show me your ways. The Gemara in Brachos explains that he asked Hashem, why do righteous people suffer? That was the one question he asked Hashem. And Hashem basically told him, I'm not going to tell you. That was the one thing Moshe did not get a direct answer from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's interesting that after he couldn't get an answer by direct divine revelation, he tries to think about it philosophically. And in that sense, Iyov, if you learn like never really happened, which is an opinion of the Gemara, Iyov is a philosophical novel where Moshe Rabbeinu tries to explore an answer to a question that Hashem did not give him a direct answer to. So it's a fascinating idea that Moshe Rabbeinu himself was struggling with a question that Hashem didn't answer him. And the funny thing is, after all of the book of Iyov, he comes up with the same answer Hashem gave him. Don't know. He's going through all the different possibilities. And the end of the book of Iyov, again, we'll talk when we get there. It will be a long time, but when we get there, we'll talk about it. Is ultimately this is an unanswered, unknowable question. You see, so that's so just a sense of the authorship, the editorial function, the idea that some authority had to determine in the mass of writings, just as I mentioned by the Apocrypha. Right, there were whole books that Bichlal were excluded because they weren't considered kadosh. Even within the works of Yeshayahu, the works of Yechezkel, there had to be things that were determined if they were divrei nevuah or they were divrei chachma. Now, in a way, it's a chaval that the divrei chachma were lost. I mean, listen, we have so many Musar Svarim, right? I mean, it would be very nice to have a Musar Sefer from Yeshayahu Hanavi, even if it wasn't prophecy. Right? So it's a little bit schwer to me. Why would these non-prophetic books of prophets be lost unless we go back to the idea that they were not needed ladoros, meaning to say, it's a little different than what I said. Instead of saying they were not books of prophecy, maybe they were not books of enduring prophecy. That's a possibility, meaning a Navi had a career. A Navi had a job. A Navi may have helped you find your car keys or your donkeys or, where you can get the best falafel, whatever it would be. In other words, Nevi'im were used for all sorts of things. So it could very well be Yeshayahu. I'm just speculating. We don't know. Yeshayahu may have had thousands of pages. He may have, notated, logged in all of the prophetic experiences he ever had, but they were not considered Tzricha L'Doros. And that is what the Anshe Knesset Agdola did. As opposed to Yirmiyahu, apparently Yirmiyahu only recorded the things that were found of enduring value, so there was no editorial exclusions in the book of Yirmiyahu. Okay, that's how you understand the difference. Why Yirmiyahu wrote his book, Yechezkel is credited to Anshe Knesset Agdola, and Yeshayahu is credited to Chizkiyahu V'Siyata, even though they didn't write the books, but they had to exercise a certain editorial decision-making. Okay, so the bottom line basically is that how the Tanakh was compiled is complicated. It's not pashut, and there's a lot of things we just don't know b'diuk exactly how those things were done. So I think Baruch Hashem, we completed our introduction. So next week we'll actually try to start with the book of Yoshua and just go through the narratives of the Sefer. Okay, have a good week.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome Ech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.